I wish you were poor. Those were the first words she said after the waiter placed their coffees on the table. Daniel almost choked. He had prepared himself for awkward small talk, polite smiles, maybe even subtle rejection. But not that, not from a woman who had just agreed to meet him after weeks of gentle, thoughtful conversations online. He blinked at her, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The cafe hummed around them, soft music, clinking cups, low conversations, but in that moment, everything felt painfully silent. "I'm sorry," he asked. Across from him sat Emily Carter, 32, sharp-eyed but warm, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked composed, but there was something fragile in her expression. "I said," she repeated quietly, wrapping both hands around her cup, "I wish you were poor." Daniel exhaled slowly. 40 years old, widowed for 3 years, father of 2, he had faced worse than confusing dates. He had buried his wife. He had held his children while they cried themselves to sleep. He had rebuilt his life from the wreckage of grief. But this was new. He wasn't poor. Not anymore. Daniel owned a growing construction company. He had worked day and night after his wife's death, partly to survive, partly to distract himself from the silence of their home. The business had unexpectedly flourished. He had paid off the mortgage, bought a safer car, built college funds for his children, Sophie, 8, sensitive and artistic, and Liam, 6, all energy and questions. He had done it all for them. And now this woman was wishing it away. Emily looked at him carefully. "You don't understand," she said softly. "Every man I've dated in the last 5 years had money. And every single one of them treated people like expenses. Like investments. Like something to manage." Daniel leaned back, studying her. "My father grew up poor," she continued. "He worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted, but he never missed a bedtime story. When he finally made money, something changed. He became obsessed with status. Bigger house, better car, better friends." She swallowed. He stopped being present. The vulnerability in her voice shifted something inside him. "I've watched money take good men and turn them into strangers," she said. "When I found out you owned a company, that you were doing well, I panicked. I didn't want to get attached to another man who would eventually love his success more than his family." Daniel felt the sting of her assumption, but also the weight of her fear. "I don't love my success," he said quietly. "I love my kids." Emily's eyes flickered. "Money doesn't change what you value," he added. "It just exposes it." The first date ended politely but unsettled. They parted with a handshake that felt far too formal for the emotional storm that had passed between them. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Sophie colored quietly beside him and Liam built a lopsided tower of blocks. "Dad," Sophie asked without looking up. "Are you sad?" He smiled gently. "Why would you think that? You get that wrinkle between your eyebrows when you're thinking too hard." He laughed softly. "I'm not sad. Just thinking." And he was. About whether Emily was right. About whether he had been absent without realizing it. About the nights he had come home late because another contract needed his attention. About the school event he had once missed because a client insisted on a last-minute meeting. He told himself it was all for them. But was he slowly becoming what Emily feared? The following weeks were complicated. Emily didn't disappear. Instead, she surprised him. She asked to meet his children. Not at a fancy restaurant. Not at his house, but at a public park on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel hesitated. He had sworn never to introduce someone casually into his children's lives. Stability mattered, but something about Emily's sincerity convinced him. That Saturday, she arrived in jeans and sneakers, holding a small bag. Inside were sidewalk chalks and a cheap kite. She knelt down to Sophie's level and said, "I heard you love drawing. Want to show me how good you are?" She chased Liam across the grass, laughing when he declared himself the fastest superhero alive. Daniel watched from a distance, arms crossed, heart conflicted. There was no pretense in her. No performance. No interest in his car parked nearby. No questions about the size of his house. She asked Sophie about her favorite colors. She listened to Liam explain his dream of becoming an astronaut. And when Sophie tripped and scraped her knee, Emily was the first to kneel, brushing dirt away gently, whispering reassurance. That night, as Daniel tucked his kids into bed, Sophie whispered, "Is she going to come again?" "Maybe," he said carefully. "I hope so," she replied. But challenges didn't disappear so easily. 2 months later, Daniel faced a crisis at work. A major project fell apart. Investors threatened to pull out. Lawsuits loomed. For the first time in years, his business trembled on the edge. Old habits surged back. Late nights, missed dinners, phone calls during bedtime. Emily noticed the shift immediately. "You're doing it," she said one evening when he finally met her for coffee after canceling twice. "Doing what?" "Choosing the company over your life." "It's not that simple," he snapped, exhaustion fraying his patience. 30 families depend on me. If this fails, they lose jobs. My kids lose security. And if you lose yourself?" she asked quietly. The tension between them thickened. Daniel felt torn in ways he hadn't since his wife's death. Responsibility pulled him one way. Fear pulled him another. Love, new, fragile love, waited uncertainly in the middle. The breaking point came when Liam had a school performance. Daniel promised he'd be there. That afternoon, a crucial investor demanded an emergency meeting. "If you walk out," the investor warned, "we reconsider everything." Daniel stared at the clock. 3:45 p.m. The performance started at 4 o'clock. For a split second, Emily's words echoed in his mind. "I wish you were poor." Poor meant fewer expectations, fewer people depending on him, fewer impossible choices. But then he thought of Sophie's observant eyes. Liam's superhero grin. The nights he had promised himself he would never let them feel abandoned. He closed his laptop. "I have somewhere to be," he told the investor. He drove like he hadn't driven in years. When he slipped into the school auditorium, slightly out of breath, Liam was already on stage, small, nervous, scanning the crowd. And then their eyes met. Liam's face lit up. He waved, almost missing his cue. Daniel felt something break open in his chest. After the performance, Emily stood beside him in the hallway. She had come too, sitting quietly near the back. "You chose them," she said. He nodded. "I almost didn't. But you did." The business survived. Not because Daniel sacrificed his family, but because he restructured it. Delegated more. Promoted capable managers. Accepted that control wasn't the same as responsibility. It wasn't easy. There were months of financial strain. A smaller profit margin. Fewer luxuries. But more dinners together. More bedtime stories. More Saturdays at the park. One evening, nearly a year after their first date, Daniel and Emily sat on the porch while the kids played inside. "You know," he said, "I think I understand what you meant now." She raised an eyebrow. "You didn't actually want me to be poor." She smiled faintly. "No, you just didn't want me to be owned by what I earned." Emily's eyes softened. "Money isn't the problem. Forgetting why you earn it is." Daniel reached for her hand. "I'm not poor," he said. "But I've learned how to live like I remember what it felt like to have nothing." She squeezed his fingers. "That's all I ever hoped for." Inside the house, laughter echoed. Sophie teaching Liam how to draw a rocket ship, both of them arguing over which color flames should be. Daniel looked at that small, imperfect, beautiful scene and realized something profound. Wealth wasn't measured in contracts signed or properties owned. It was measured in moments you refused to miss. On their wedding day 2 years later, Emily whispered something different into his ear. "I'm glad you weren't poor," she said. He smiled. "Why's that?" "Because you proved that a man can have everything, and still choose what matters most." And that was the lesson Daniel carried forward. Success is not about how high you climb. It's about who you hold onto while you're climbing. Sometimes, the richest life is built not by earning more, but by choosing wisely what you refuse to lose.